So last year, I played Cyberpunk 2077, Avowed, and Tainted Grail: The Fall of Avalon. 3 open-world RPGs where the main plot revolves around the main character running around with a guy in their head. Funny coincidence that. Baldur's Gate 3 is not an open-world exploration action RPG like those 3, but it also has a guy in your head that you get to customize, who is less of a presence until Act 3, but is a central figure nevertheless. Arguably, there are snippets of this present in Dragon Age Veilguard with Solas's role, and the 2025 Game Awards trailer for aspiring Mass Effect successor Exodus seems to imply that Matthew McConaughey's character will also be a guy in the main character's head. If you're watching this video after Exodus is out and it turns out Matthew McConaughey is not a guy in your head, then pretend I didn't mention it. Regardless, the RPG about having a guy in your head seems to be a burgeoning subgenre nowadays, so I figured I'd spend a little bit of time examining how this particular narrative tool functions. Perhaps its most basic and obvious utility is in creating a central relationship for an open-ended game that can be a constant presence regardless of where the player is or what they've been doing. Other main characters who have to occupy a physical space within their worlds can be left behind or go off to do other things, and if they're forced to stick with you all the time, it can be unbelievable or intrusive to a free-flowing experience. But by enabling extended absences, the games might cost these characters the presence or familiarity to leave enough of an emotional impression in a player. Companions in Fallout or Skyrim can die, depending on the settings or if you kill them yourself, or be dismissed or not recruited or swapped out. Non-companion side characters like Martin Septim in Oblivion end up stationary while the player goes on missions, and you only have a handful of real interactions with them, and so, in comparison with other stories, the central relationship of the game ends up underdeveloped and missing a lot of its potential. Open-world RPGs like this don't tend to have a single, permanent, corporeal companion like Ellie in Last of Us or Elizabeth in BioShock Infinite. There could be one that does, but Western open-world RPGs tend to inherently prioritize the player's desires and goals in the interest of a sort of quest-based free-roam experience. The 2 companion daughter figures to a Troy Baker voice protagonist whose names start with EL from games released in 2013 each feature in very linear games that heavily script the direction of the story, and so any clashes of personality or changes in character goals or locations can be directly planned for. In an open-world game, if a story conflict arises between player character and a physically embodied deuteragonist, then the developers have to choose between resolving the conflict quickly, perhaps too quickly, to keep the companion around, or allow for an indefinite separation until the player gets around to whichever quest reconciles them. And that can seriously mess with pacing or any planned interactions between the two in side quests. Or alternatively, the developers could limit the agency of the companion and have them always defer to the player in a way that risks weakening them as a character. It's easier to justify a perma-companion going along with whatever you do even through interpersonal conflicts if they are literally just a passenger, a guy in your head. And in fact, that very situation can cause juicy narrative conflicts and developments as a strong-willed character like Johnny Silverhand chafes against his limited control over his host body. That said, Avowed and Baldur's Gate 3, and presumably Exodus, are intended to have constant traveling companions with you in addition to the guy in your head, which creates a very different dynamic. In Avowed, the guy in your head is cause for worry from your companions, since this is a relationship you are developing on your own without their perception, but still has ramifications for everyone else. In Baldur's Gate 3, everyone has the same guy in their head in different forms, though one of my great disappointments with how the game handles this is that once Act 3 begins and the guy in your head becomes more central to you, there isn't any development between them and any of the other companions we know that they've talked to. Point being, even games that don't need a guy in your head to provide you with an emotional anchor as you go on an epic journey through dozens of fleeting side stories can make use of this trope anyway, but this risks an imbalance in the narrative focus. Baldur's Gate 3's companions are so strong, and the Dream Visitor's role is so downplayed for so much of the first 2/3, that while I do find the Dream Visitor a mostly compelling character, they can get severely overshadowed by the proper companions. Of all the guys in your head I'll be discussing in this video, the Dream Visitor is the only one whose relationship to the player doesn't feel like the one the whole story revolves around, even though if you think about it, it technically is. Avowed is the opposite, where I really enjoyed the mysterious voice, but found the companions just fine on the whole. And yes, for spoiler reasons, I will refer to this entity as the mysterious voice rather than their name, even though it's maybe not necessary because their name doesn't mean anything before it's revealed. Whatever. The mysterious voice is way more present throughout Avowed than the Dream Visitor is in the first 2 acts of Baldur's Gate 3, and takes more of an obvious interest in why you're making the choices that you're making. This allows your relationship with them to properly feel significant, and makes the mysterious voice much more of a fit for the guy in your head trope than the Dream Visitor, in my view. This leads into one of the possible thematic uses of a guy in your head, as an externalization of the player character's inner conflict. While Avowed's companions, especially Kai, also ask you outright to explain some of your choices, the mysterious voice does this a lot. It's one of the main avenues through which you can choose possible in-character motives for certain choices, which is great if your actual motives match up with one of those choices, and would be pretty frustrating anytime they don't. But there is a bit of a difference between how it feels when you explain yourself to Kai and explain yourself to the mysterious voice. The latter feels more directly psychological, if for no other reason than the simple fact that, again, you are talking to a guy in your head instead of a guy in front of you. But not every guy in your head functions this way. Johnny Silverhand of Cyberpunk 2077, the best guy in your head that I've come across so far, isn't as much of a sounding board for a player to use to define V, because V is already a heavily predefined protagonist. Their voice and personality are set in stone by their writing and acting. While Silverhand does force V to reflect on their choices at several points, this is 2 distinct characters interacting in a dramatic dialogue scene as narrative foils, not a blank slate being given the chance to be filled in a little by player input. Also, 2077 doesn't have companions like Avowed, just several reoccurring supporting characters with their own lives, so Silverhand serves as the single permanent companion like I described before. By putting him in V's head, making the 2 characters inseparable as soon as Act 2 begins, he can show up whenever to impart a bit of characterization or express a change in himself or in V. Even if a guy in your head doesn't directly ask you to explain your choices, their commentary on them can still provide an easy hit of reactivity, while still doing the usual character relationship development stuff that helps build emotional investment and, again, anchor the player in a strong through line in the midst of all the exploration and side quests. King Arthur in Tainted Grail is clearly trying to do a Silverhand thing, though the fact that you only get commentary from him if you sit down at a fire and directly ask him what he thinks of things makes this less effective. He doesn't interject in the middle of a scene like Silverhand or the mysterious voice, except I think once. And this seems to be done in a budget-friendly way, so it's not like this is because they could only have him interject in fancy animated Silverhand ways, so it just seems like a misstep here. Or at least all of this was true on launch. If this has changed in the most recent DLC and updates to make him chime in more, then good for him. I haven't touched the game since last summer. Also, even within these scenes, the writing just isn't as good as Cyberpunk's. So far, all of the guys in your head that I've encountered are representatives of the past in some way. Silverhand is a legendary but long dead figure who is treated in the narrative as a relic, whose band is seen as a quaint curiosity for music nerds and no one else, even though samurai merch and music is found everywhere in game, but never mind. Johnny's routinely forced to reckon with his own failures, and if his relationship with V develops in a positive direction, then both of them attempt to learn from his mistakes. The mysterious voice in Avowed has been present in the Living Lands for a very long time, and much of developing that relationship is about exploring and interpreting their past. King Arthur in Tainted Grail is trying to build to full resurrection in the hopes of restoring his kingdom from its long decay after his first death. But your journey confronts several of the ways he built it on atrocity, and could be said to have set his own kingdom up to collapse as a result. In the absence of ways to affect the present without being able to convince the player to do things, exploring the past is the only thing these guys in your head can really do. Themes of learning from the past and legacy are automatically attached to the guy in your head concept as soon as it appears. And because RPGs in general tend to put great effort into extensive world building in addition to actual plots and stories, the guy in your head that represents the past can be a great vehicle for conveying lore through characterful dialogue and relationship building with the person who lived through it. These games do have lore books to read as well, but if you're interested in the guy in your head, then you've got a way more dynamic sort of interaction with the lore, turning the act of learning in world history into a drama rather than an encyclopedia. The guy in your head thus becomes a personification of the game's setting. Their perspective on the world is fundamentally different from all the other characters, being a broader, more bird's-eye view than a character still living in its present would have. The three major examples I've been using are directly responsible for shaping their settings and now have the opportunity to explore the ramifications of their actions with the player. Johnny Silverhand is the failed rebel, someone who can compare his time with V's to remark on what has and has not changed in 50 years. Similarly, King Arthur gets to see how his kingdom has not lived up to his lofty ideals of its future and how much of that is his own fault. The mysterious voice was there to influence the past of the living lands, and with the player's guidance they can reflect on what exactly that past has taught them. And so the guy in your head also becomes a personification of the struggle between past and present, the tension between remembering important history and being dominated by it, trapped by a desire to recreate it. Part of what makes me want to explore this topic is because at the beginning of this year, I played a different open-world RPG where the plot and emotional core is centered on one specific character, but in this case the character is not a guy in your head. They're still an active agent in the world, and they're mostly characterized by the ruins left in their wake and the stories other characters tell about them. The game is Dread Delusion, and the character is Vela Kalos. For the record, Dread Delusion is awesome, and I highly recommend it, and between it, Avowed, and Tainted Grail, it is definitely the best Elder Scrolls-alike I've played recently in terms of narrative and overall experience, though it does have the simplest mechanics. Anyway, in Dread Delusion, you are chasing after Kalos as she tries to remake the world to build a so-called heaven. This involves gathering a few former crew members of hers, and a long-running side quest takes you on a tour of key spots in her personal history. As I said, she's characterized indirectly, but she is still effectively the main character of the overall story. You still build an understanding of her throughout the course of this game, even though she never becomes a guy in your head. It's a fundamentally different way to get to know the character. Not worse necessarily, but certainly less personal. You only have 3 face-to-face interactions with her, and the second time she has to ask you who you are again because the first was so unmemorable to her. It intertwines her personal self with the myth she's built around her. It means we get to know her through the perspectives of her former companions. We don't get the experience of, say, hearing Rogue talk about her view of Johnny Silverhand while we get to build our own, because he's also a guy in our head, giving us an overriding impression of him. This means that instead of focusing on getting to know Kalos, we are getting to know the world that shaped her and the ways she shaped those around her in response, through their own eyes. Again, not better or worse, just a different approach. The Rise of the Guy in Your Head plot seems to be about adding a personal relationship into a style of game that otherwise tends to favor less character-driven interactions with the wide-open game worlds, to add more direct character building where there often is indirect character building. It's an attempt to strengthen the main story in a genre that can, at times, feel more impersonal and above it all. There is certainly appeal to the wandering cowboy fantasy that the more detached version of these games can be, wandering from town to town solving side quests as a lone dragonborn or vault survivor or what have you. But other games want more emotionally meaningful and personal narratives, like Cyberpunk 2077. And so the guy in your head is the bridge that allows such a vast world to pair with such a personal story. But any trope becomes cliché if overused, if it is discovered by less effortful or less competent creators who treat it as a shortcut. I think the guy in your head is still at a point where I greet each new version of it with, "Oh, we're doing this, let's see what this version is like," rather than, "Oh, okay, another one, whatever." All the examples I've given in this video are quite different from each other beyond the very basic, descriptive, pithy trope name I've come up with. But as more developers realize the utility of the guy in your head, the more I think a standard guy is going to take shape. And realistically, it's probably going to just be copying Silverhand, the best and most popular one at time of writing, until direct imitation presumably dilutes the original's effectiveness. So as we recognize the useful tool that is the guy in your head, we must also take care not to let the guy be the only, or even default, way to add personal stakes and consistent character arcs to open-ended, exploratory RPGs. I guess that's all I had to say about this for now. Who's your favorite guy in your head? Who didn't I mention that you've been screaming at your screen that I'm forgetting? I'd love to know about more, and one way or the other, thank you for watching. Please press the YouTube buttons and the notification bell, and extra thanks to my Patreon supporters.